Night work on highways follows a different logic than daytime work. The same rest stops, truck plazas, and shoulder areas that function normally during business hours take on different characteristics once the sun sets. Professional drivers, long-haul truckers, freight operators, courier teams running overnight routes develop specific patterns about where they stop and where they don't. These patterns aren't written in training manuals. They don't appear in route planning software, but they're followed consistently across the industry. This isn't about paranoia or exaggeration. It's about pattern recognition developed over thousands of miles in conditions where response time is limited and help is far away. The question isn't whether certain stops become unworkable at night. It's understanding why and what changes in the decision process when daylight ends. Nighttime rest stops exist in a different operational state than their daytime versions. During daylight hours, these locations have consistent traffic flow. Other vehicles are present. Staff at fuel stations or service buildings are visible through windows. The parking layout is clear. Entry and exit routes are obvious. After dark, the same location changes configuration. Lighting becomes the primary organizing factor. Some stops have adequate overhead lighting across the entire lot. Others light only the fuel islands, leaving the parking area in partial darkness. A few have lighting that's been partially disabled, sometimes through neglect, sometimes deliberately. Professional drivers assess lighting before committing to a stop, not for visibility alone, but because lighting determines what happens in the time between parking and returning to the vehicle. A well-lit lot means anyone approaching a truck is visible from a distance. Movements are trackable. This doesn't prevent problems, but it changes the timing of awareness. Poorly lit lots compress that window. Someone can be alongside a vehicle before the driver inside has registered their approach. This assessment happens in seconds. The driver pulls off the highway, sees the exit ramp, and evaluates the lot before fully committing. If the lighting is inadequate, many will return to the highway and continue to the next option, even if they've already been driving for hours. Routine develops around this. Drivers who run the same routes repeatedly learn which stops maintain their infrastructure and which don't. They plan fuel and rest intervals around known good locations rather than stopping at whatever's convenient. The routine isn't about avoiding all risk. It's about avoiding preventable risk in situations where the driver is stationary and therefore more vulnerable than when moving. Silence is another factor. During the day, engine noise, traffic, air brakes, and general activity create a baseline sound environment. At night, especially between midnight and 4 a.m., that baseline drops significantly. This makes certain sounds more noticeable: footsteps on gravel, a vehicle door closing nearby, voices at a distance. Experienced drivers use this. They park, shut down, and listen for a few minutes before exiting the cab. They're not listening for anything specific. They're listening for patterns that feel inconsistent with a functioning rest stop. Multiple engines idling without movement. Vehicles positioned in ways that don't match normal parking logic. Groups of people stationary near exit routes. None of these indicate a definite problem, but they indicate a situation where the driver would need to process more information while fatigued, and where reversing course becomes complicated. So the decision is made earlier, at the entrance, before parking. Fatigue complicates this process. By the time a driver is looking for a place to stop, they've often been on the road for 8, 10, or 12 hours. Decision-making is slower. Risk assessment becomes harder. The desire to simply stop and rest competes with the need to evaluate whether the location is functional. Many drivers use a preset list, not mental, written, or digitally saved. They know which stops on their route are reliable at night and plan around those exclusively. This removes the decision-making burden when they're least capable of making good decisions. The decision to avoid a stop happens under time pressure and incomplete information. A driver exits the highway and enters a rest area. Within 30 to 60 seconds, They need to determine whether to commit or return to the highway. Re-entering highway traffic while fatigued adds its own risk, so the decision has weight. What they prioritize: lighting coverage across the entire lot, not just near buildings. The presence of other commercial vehicles, other trucks, not just passenger cars. Clear sight lanes from the cab to surrounding areas. Functional security infrastructure, meaning cameras that appear operational, not just mounted. They also look at employee presence. A staffed fuel desk visible through windows. Attendants moving between pumps. This doesn't guarantee safety, but it indicates the location is operating as intended. What they deliberately ignore: distance to the next stop. If the current location feels wrong, they don't negotiate with themselves about whether they can make it another 40 miles. They leave. They ignore the fact that the lot might be fine. The assessment isn't about certainty. It's about whether the environment allows for rest without requiring constant vigilance. If it doesn't, the stop fails its function regardless of whether an actual threat exists. They also ignore their own fatigue in the moment of decision. The urge to stop intensifies the longer someone has been driving. But experienced drivers know that stopping in the wrong place doesn't actually provide rest. They'll be semi-alert the entire time, monitoring sounds and movement. It's better to continue to a proper location. Why hesitation is costly at night. Once a driver has entered a rest area and begun to evaluate it, they're partially committed. The truck is off the highway, speed has dropped, and they're now occupying space in a lot that may have limited visibility. If they decide to leave, they need to navigate back to the entrance, wait for a gap in highway traffic, and reaccelerate a loaded vehicle. This takes time and creates a window where they're predictable and slow-moving, so the decision can't be reconsidered multiple times. It happens once, at entry, based on immediate observation. Some drivers have a rule: if you hesitate, you leave. If the gut reaction to a stop is uncertainty, that's treated as a no rather than requiring additional evaluation. This reduces decision fatigue and prevents the common error of talking yourself into a bad situation because you're tired. Professional drivers also track patterns over time. If a stop that was previously functional starts showing signs of deterioration, broken lights that stay broken, increased loitering, staff that disappear after dark, it gets mentally recategorized. They don't wait for a specific incident. The stop simply moves from yes to no in their planning. Certain rules are followed across the industry but never appear in training. First, never park near the back of a lot if better positions are available closer to the main building. Rear positions have longer response times and reduced visibility from any staffed areas. They also complicate exit routes if the driver needs to leave quickly. Second, if a stop feels wrong at night, it is wrong. This sounds subjective, but it reflects accumulated pattern recognition. Drivers who have worked nights for years have seen thousands of stops. Their assessment isn't random. It's based on environmental cues they've learned to read without conscious analysis. Third, avoid stops where passenger vehicles outnumber commercial vehicles after midnight. Rest areas used heavily by truckers tend to self-regulate. Other drivers are present, awake, and aware of their surroundings. Stops that shift to primarily passenger traffic at night often attract different activity patterns. Fourth, check for visible security presence, but don't rely on it. Some stops have regular patrols. Others have cameras that may or may not be monitored. But security response time at a highway rest stop is measured in minutes at best, often longer. By the time help arrives, the situation has already resolved one way or another. Fifth, if you see another commercial driver leave immediately after pulling in, follow them. They've seen something you haven't, and there's no benefit to finding out what it was. Why experience matters more than instruction. New drivers are taught rules of hours, load securement, vehicle inspection. They're not taught how to evaluate a rest stop at 2 a.m. based on the positioning of vehicles and the behavior of people in the lot. This knowledge transfers through observation and repetition. A new driver runs routes with experienced operators and learns which stops get used and which get skipped. The reasons aren't always explained. They're demonstrated through behavior. Over time, the new driver builds their own mental map. This stop is always good. That stop is fine during the day but wrong at night. This one used to be acceptable but isn't anymore. The unwritten rules exist because written rules can't adapt to changing conditions. A stop's status changes based on factors that aren't captured in official guidance. Local economic conditions, changes in management, law enforcement presence, maintenance patterns. Drivers adjust in real time. The system works because information spreads informally through the network of people running the same routes. When routines are followed, the outcome is operational efficiency. Drivers rest at locations where they can actually rest. They wake up alert, continue their route on schedule, and maintain their hours of service compliance. The stop fulfills its intended function. Freight arrives on time. Drivers remain within legal driving limits. The vehicle stays secure. When routines are ignored, several things change. A driver stops at a questionable location because they're too fatigued to continue. They can't sleep properly because they're semi-alert to their surroundings. They wake up more tired than when they stopped. This affects their performance for the next section of driving. Reaction time slows. Decision-making degrades. The risk of an accident increases over the remaining hours of their shift. In other cases, a driver loses time. They stop, assess, leave, and continue to another location. This adds miles and delays the schedule. It's still better than the alternative, but it has cost. Some drivers have reported theft from unsecured cargo areas at problematic stops. Others have dealt with vehicle tampering, fuel caps removed, tire valves loosened, attempts to access the cab. These aren't common outcomes, but they're possible outcomes. And because they're preventable through better stop selection, they represent failures in the decision process. The practical consequence of following unwritten rules is boring consistency. The same stops work. The same routes function. Nothing unexpected happens. That's the goal. Night shift road work operates on patterns developed over years of repetition, the logic of which stops to avoid isn't arbitrary. It's built from thousands of individual assessments made by people whose job requires them to be alone, stationary, and fatigued in locations they don't control. The rules exist because the alternative, stopping anywhere and hoping for the best, produces outcomes that range from inconvenient to unworkable. From the outside, the decision process might look overly cautious. From inside the cab at night, on a route you run weekly, it's just standard procedure. These patterns make sense only from inside the work.